Well, like I said, it is Father's Day, and we are celebrating and thinking about fathers. And when we think about fathers in the Bible, there's many different examples of fathers that we could look at. But I want to mention one by the name of Jesse. Jesse was a father, and he had 8 sons. 8 sons. Anybody have a family of 8 siblings there? That sounded like that would take a pretty good sized dinner table for everybody to get around that with eight siblings. He had 8 sons. And we have to also really remind ourselves that all of these great people of the Bible, they didn't have any of the luxuries that we take for granted today. There was no air conditioning. There was no electricity, no television, no radio. Almost everything we do to entertain ourselves or to have fun with, they didn't have. None of it. And life was much more difficult back then, even if you were well off. You still had to get out and make your living and take care of things, and children had to do their chores. Very different, I suppose, than our lifestyle today. And so, even though things were very different, there were some things that were still the same. Children were still children, and fathers were still fathers. And one of the callings for us as fathers is that we have to be fathers in the time in which God has us, right? Jesse did the fathering thing back in his day, and you're called to be the father now that you are. Well, Jesse had 8 sons, and that was during the time when the king of Israel was Saul. But God rejected Saul for being king. And God told the prophet Samuel that he was going to anoint a new king, or the next king, to be the king of Israel. And it was going to be one of Jesse's 8 sons. And so Samuel went to identify and anoint the new king. And so they gathered together, and Jesse brought all of his sons except the youngest one. And they thought for sure that the new king would be the oldest son. He looked like he ought to be the king. He had a very big and tall and noble bearing. But God told Samuel not to look on the countenance or the outward appearance, that God looks at the heart. And it's a very wonderful teaching there. And they went through all of those sons, and the new king wasn't among them. And so Samuel asked Jesse, do you have any other children, any other sons? And he says, yes, the youngest, and he's tending the sheep. And they said, well, go get him. We'll wait right here till you go get him. And they went to get the youngest son, and his name was David. King David, would-be King David, he was out tending the sheep. He was out taking care of the flock. What a wonderful story that whole thing is. And David was anointed as the next king, but he didn't become the king yet. Saul was still the king. David knew he was going to be king. He'd been anointed, but he still had a lot of things to do. Well, what I want to look at is the fact that not only was Jesse a father, but then David was a father too. And David had sons, and one of his sons would be the next king. And so it's a very interesting thing when we look at the Bible. We can see these generational jumps, but it seems so different as we're living out our part in our day. Because those of you who are fathers now, you can remember when you were young boys, and you can remember your father. And as time has passed, you grew and became a man and became a father yourself. And as time continues to pass, one day your children will grow up and have children. And if you have a son or sons, they too may become fathers. What a blessing it is that God gives us these opportunities. And so I want to jump ahead in time from the day that young David, who was a young teenager, in fact, he was so young, the next chapter, it's in 1 Samuel 16, but we're not going there, don't turn there. After he gets anointed, the next chapter talks about when David faced Goliath. You remember the story of David and Goliath. Well, the interesting thing is David's older 3 brothers, his oldest 3 were old enough to be in the army, Israel's army, the army for Saul. And they were the ones that were being backed down by this Goliath. He was so intimidating that they were afraid of him. And Jesse sent his son David to the front lines to bring provisions, food. And when David was there at the front lines, he heard Goliath bad-mouthing God. And David looked around this young teenage boy and he says, how come nobody's going out there to whip him? That's not a direct quote. But that's exactly what, right? You remember the story, and nobody would go. And finally David says, well, I'm going. And you know the story of David and Goliath. But that just demonstrates how young he was. He wasn't even old enough to be in the army. So he was a very young man, a very young boy, really, a teenage boy. But now I want to skip ahead, and all the things you know about King David, kind of keep those in mind, because we're moving ahead in time to 1 Kings chapter 2. Because in 1 Kings chapter 2, David is a very old man and he's about to die. And he's giving a charge to his son Solomon, who will be the next king. And I thought, how wonderful when we look at this, what a history and a legacy that David leaves. But also we see that he's concerned about what's coming next and about his son. And part of being a father is always to be concerned about your children and what's coming next. And I just thought this would make a wonderful Father's Day passage, because what David tells his son Solomon is a good message for all of us and for all of our fathers to think about passing on to their children as well. And so that's where we are this morning, 1 Kings chapter 2. Look at verse 1. 1 Kings chapter 2, verse 1 says, now the days of David drew nigh that he should die, and he charged Solomon his son, saying, I go the way of all the earth. Be thou strong therefore, and show thyself a man. And we want to just stop right there. We're going to look at a couple of more verses. So David knows. This is a beautiful and very touching and emotional moment between he and his son Solomon. David knows he's going to die. The Bible tells us that it's appointed unto men once to die. All of us are going to die. And you can't really escape that. The only real exception is if the rapture happens before that time. But barring that event in your lifetime, we're all going to die. Mortality is a constant reminder that our time here on earth is short. We don't have forever. It can feel like you have plenty of time when you're very young, but even that's deceptive, because you never really know how much time you have, the young or the old. We really don't know. But David knew by the time he says these words, he's very, very old. He knows his time is short. And so he charges his son. He calls and commands his son. And what would you tell your children? Dads, what would you tell your son if you were in this place that David was in? But look at what he says once again. Verse 2, I go the way of all the earth. That means he's going to die like everyone else. Be thou strong, therefore. The first thing he tells his son is to be strong. We need to be strong. And I especially want to talk to the men today. We need strong, strong men if we're going to do and be what God's called us to be. Now, ladies, you need to be strong too, but David is talking to his son and telling him to be strong. I don't know if there's a much more difficult time than when you're seeing your parent pass away. That's very difficult. But we have to be strong in times of loss. And David knew that a great new responsibility was going to be placed on the shoulders of his son very soon, and that he was going to need strength. Well, we too need the strength of the Lord if we're going to do what we need to do in the days ahead. Don't you think so? What does it mean to be strong? It means to be firm. It means to be resolute. It means to be tough. Tough. We need toughness. We need mental toughness. We need spiritual toughness. We need physical toughness. We really can't afford the luxury of being too soft, because life doesn't give you a break because you're not prepared. We must be prepared. So be strong. And then the second thing he says, the last part of verse 2 says, and show thyself a man. And show thyself a man. Be manly. Be manly. We used to hear about that a lot more often than we do today. Be a man. Grow up. Be a man. What does it mean to be manly? Well, it means to be brave, first of all, to have some courage, to have some backbone. That's part of what it is to be a man. It means to be mature. It means to have some confidence. And it means to be crusty. Can I use that word, crusty? You know, men ought to be more crusty than women. If you don't have some crustiness, then you're not really what you need to be. If your wife is just as crusty as you are, well, you need to toughen up a little bit. Because out of the two of you, the man ought to be the more crusty of the two. He ought to have more bark on his exterior. A man needs to be tough. A man needs to be a man. A man needs to be the one that when something goes bump in the night, he's the one that gets up and goes. You don't flip a coin to see if the wife goes. And the man's not the one, if something's scary, he's not the one screaming alongside his wife if she's screaming. We need to be manly and brave. 1 Corinthians chapter 13 and verse 11, an interesting thing Paul wrote. 1 Corinthians 13:11 says, Paul says, when I was a child, I spake as a child, I understood as a child, I thought as a child, but when I became a man, I put away childish things. There is a transition that's expected from childhood to manhood. When you're a child, it's okay to act like a child, to think like a child, to react like a child. But when you're a man, you put away those things. One of the things is, as we become fathers and as we become men, and hopefully you've become a man before you become a father. That's not always the case. And by the way, there are a lot of boys that have children. And it doesn't matter how old you are. You might be a 30-year-old boy. But if you're not taking on the responsibilities of a father and of a man, you're still just a boy. We used to hear a lot about, as we were growing up, you know, boys were treated differently. There came a time when Dad would say, are you just a little crybaby? And girls were treated differently than boys. And today they think that's wrong. I don't think that's wrong at all. We were more delicate with the girls. The boys were tougher and expected to be tougher. A girl fell over on her bicycle, they'd rush over to help her up. A boy fell over and Dad would say, get up, you're all right, walk it off. Isn't that right? Toughen up, because you need to be tough in this world. We can't all be delicate. In fact, we need the tough, strong men to allow the women the privilege of being delicate. And there's too many weak men. Too many weak fathers raising weak sons that are going to get married one day. And they scream and are scared. And my goodness, look around when you go to Walmart next time. I see these young teenage boys and I wonder who's raising these boys. Well, a lot of them don't have fathers in their lives. And let me tell you something, fathers are not intended to just be second-string mothers. And society seems to want to think that's all we are, is stand-ins for mom. We're not quite as good as mom, but we'll do until mom can get her rest and take back over. No, you don't understand. We're not second-string mothers. We're first-string fathers. And we're supposed to act like fathers and be fathers. and raise our kids as fathers would raise them. And every child ought to have the experience of a father and a mother. That's God's plan. Not everybody gets that experience, but that's how it ought to be. Strong fathers. Stu Weber, a Special Forces 3 Bronze Star vet, he says this: "Our culture is in deep trouble, and at the heart of its trouble is its loss of a vision for manhood. If it's difficult for you and me as adult males to maintain our masculine balance in this gender-neutral culture, imagine what it must be like for our sons who are growing up in an increasingly feminized world." Yeah. You see it all the time. You see it on the television shows. You see it on what they expect of boys, to kind of sit there and express your feelings. Well, some boys do that, but most don't. We're not like that. And we like to roughhouse. And fathers ought to roughhouse with their sons. And then they take it a little easier on their daughters. Some daughters like to do that too, but you always have to be careful and you have to kind of back off just a little bit. So you don't slam your daughter on the ground with as much force as you might your son. But it's all good for them. It's good for them. And when you were a child, you do childish things, but then you become a man and you put away those things. And the more you become a man, the less you need somebody to bail you out and help you do what you ought to be doing for yourself. You know, when you're a child and something bothers you, you might raise your arms and just cry. Oh, cry. You know, babies cry. And then as they get a little older, well, they learn. They learn to take care of themselves. And part of the transition from being a child to a man is that you learn to take care of yourself. You learn to do things for yourself. And I remember in my teenage years, I don't know about you, but I was kind of insulted when my parents suggested that I couldn't take care of myself and needed me to, someone to make sure this was okay and that was okay. And I said, I can do that. There wasn't anything I didn't think I could do. Flat tire, I know how to change a flat tire. I know how to get home. I know how to navigate around. I know how to take care of myself. And I felt that way, and I was driven that way, and I'm not holding myself up. I know all of you felt that way too. It's part of that process of growing up. And I couldn't wait to get out of the house and be on my own, and I did as soon as I could. That's part of that rugged individualism that used to be embedded into the hearts of every person, not just boys, but girls as well. And you think of growing up back in the days of David. And you think of how he grew up, the youngest of 8. Do you think the youngest child is treated different than the oldest? See, I'm the oldest. And a lot of times you'll hear that was the baby of the family. They was treated, Kimberly and Ryan, they have 4. And it does seem like the youngest gets a little bit special extra treatment. Imagine being in a family of 8. But however you think about that, imagine what it was like growing up for David, tending sheep and dealing with that, and then what it was like for Solomon, the king's son. Solomon was brought up in a home of privilege and wealth, right? He was the prince, one of David's sons, a completely different upbringing. I wonder if he ever tended sheep at all. He might not have. King David's son? I doubt he was ever left out in a field somewhere tending the sheep like David did. But we all have different experiences growing up. And so I don't want to try to think that we're all exactly the same, because we're not all the same, but we all have the same need, and that's the need to grow and be mature and become adults. And our fathers are an important part of that. And they are just as important as mothers. When we think about a father that's having to raise girls because the mother's not there for whatever reason, we automatically think, oh, that's going to be so hard. I mean, fathers just don't know how to relate to all the needs that those girls are going to have. And we see that clearly. Well, I'm here to tell you the opposite is just as true. boys need something that mothers just can't give because they're women. And a lot of our problem today in society is fatherless homes. And I think you've heard that and you know that, the presence of men. And I celebrate and congratulate all of you fathers that are doing the great job that you're doing with your sons and with your daughters. Keep up the good work. Well, when we become men, we want to become responsible individuals. And that's part of becoming an adult, is taking on responsibility. And so many of the young fathers today don't take on the responsibility. In fact, it's so common that they even have new terms, and they'll call someone a baby daddy. How insulting is that? That you don't even earn the title of father, you're just a baby daddy, you're just a breeder, someone that, that's just... And society kind of just says, yeah, okay. Everybody knows what that means these days. How sad that is. They reject the responsibilities that are theirs, and that's part of immaturity. True men reject that kind of passivity. And good fathers teach their sons and their daughters how to accept responsibility. True and good fathers are the first line of experience about having demands placed on you and consequences if you don't do them. The first line of defense, the first line of discipline is usually from a father. It's also from a mother. And I thank God for the fathers that do that. Well, he goes on in verse 3, again back in 1 Kings 2, and verse 3, after he says, show thyself a man, he says, and keep the charge of the Lord. What does that mean? It means do your duty. Do your duty. We all have duties. We all have responsibilities. You can't just bail out. We're living in a time where it's easy to just live in a fantasy world with video games, virtual reality, with drugs. And we see these poor young people, well, all age now, not just young, these drug-addicted individuals that are held captive by their addiction, and their lives are a shipwreck. They are not what they could have been or should have been because of the choices that they've made, and many of them only live to try to, maintain their high or to live in a fantasy world. How sad that is. David and Solomon, neither one had to worry about that. They had to live in the real world. And young men used to not have to worry about, will they learn how to get crusty? Well, they did just by living. If you were young back in those days, you had to deal with slaughtering animals and preparing them. And, well, the women did too. Well, that'd be traumatic for me. If I had to go kill a hog, people talk about hog killing time, and they usually, when they tell me about that, they smile like it was some great thing. That can't have been that great. But it did create a crustiness to go and deal with farm animals and work the fields and do all those things. Toughened you up. We don't have to do that. Today I see commercials for men's cosmetics. Really? We went out to eat the other day, and a husband and wife were coming into the restaurant, and his purse was just as big as hers. I've got a picture of it. I couldn't believe it. Come on. We've got to be better than that, bigger than that, stronger than that. Keep your charge. Do your duty. That's what that means. Keep your charge, the charge of the Lord thy God, it says in verse 3. And it continues, to walk in His ways. That means to live a godly life. You've got to choose to do that, to live a godly life. What does He want me to do? How does He want me to be? Not only that, to keep His statutes. You see that? His statutes and His commandments and His judgments and His testimonies as it is written in the law of Moses. Yeah, all of those things, His statutes, commandments, judgments, and testimonies, they're kind of like a catalog of all the different maybe categories that you might think of. For example, the statutes might refer to the ceremonial part of the law, all the things that were intended to do in the ceremonies of following the Lord. Then His commandments might refer to the moral code, the morality that's taught in the law of Moses. His judgments may refer to the civil part of the law. I mean, what do you do, if you have a problem with a neighbor, a boundary dispute? They had civil laws that they had to follow as well. And His and His testimonies may very well have referred to the holy traditions that had been developed over the years to honor God. And it says, keep on doing those things. And then David tells his son why. The rest of verse 3, why? Where it says in the end of verse 3, that thou mayest prosper. You see that? That thou mayest prosper in all that thou doest, and whithersoever thou turnest thyself. Wherever you go, whatever you're doing. Verse 4 continues that the Lord may continue His word which He spake concerning me, David, saying, if thy children take heed to their way, and to walk before me in truth with all their heart and with all their soul, there shall not fail thee, saith He, a man on the throne of Israel. In other words, what is he saying there? If you will pass on and get your sons to live in a godly way like you did, David, God promises that He will keep the integrity of your dynasty, and that generation after generation of your sons will sit on the throne. Right? Well, now, of course, this is talking about in Old Testament times and the nation of Israel, and so there's some important differences between then and now, but there's still some tremendously important similarities, and that is that God calls all of His children to live in a godly way. And He calls all of His parents, all of us as parents, fathers and mothers, to raise up our children, right, in the ways of the Lord. And that when we do that, there's certain blessings and promises that attach if we can do that, and if we will do that. So important. Men, raise up your sons. There seems to be a war against masculinity today. And so many times it's as if they want the men and the boys to be more like girls in their softness and their reactions and their thinking. Not to take anything away from you women. I mean, we love you, and that we love the differences. But men and women are different. And it would be just as unreasonable to try and make girls act like boys as it is to make boys act like girls. Today in our society, it's the strangest thing. It's a strange double standard. In one sense, they want to pretend like there's really no difference and we need to be as alike as possible. And then in the other sense, it's like they want to defend the right of a woman or a girl who thinks that she's a boy to switch sides. But if there's really no difference, why bother switching? You see the inconsistency in that thinking? If we're all basically the same with just some slight body part differences? Well, of course not. We're very, very different. And so when we think about Father's Day, and that's what this is all about, your duty, your responsibility, Father, is to pass on the great values that were given to you through your father and to your father through his father. All the way. And a lot of things you're given by your mother, of course, and I'm not downplaying mothers. I'm just wanting to upplay the significant role of fathers in our society today. It's just as important now as it has ever been. Lord, help us be faithful fathers. Well, one father might say, well, what if I don't have any sons? You've been really talking about fathers passing on a legacy and teaching to your sons. What if I don't have any sons? That's all right. Your role showing your daughters what a real man is supposed to be like is infinitely valuable. Because one day she's got to go out there and see if she can find her a real man to marry and to unite with and to live with and to be a partner with all the rest of her life. Don't you want her to marry a real man? I do. I want all of my kids and my grandkids, my granddaughters. And so the role of father is just as important for the daughter. The daughter needs to see what a real man is like, how a real husband treats a wife, so that when she looks around, she can find one like her dad in the important ways. So fathers, I want to celebrate you once again this morning. The greatest father of all is our Heavenly Father. And He shows us the greatest example of all. Complete love, but also demanding a lifestyle of accountability. Both of those things. That's what a true father does. And I hope that each of you had that experience. God is so wonderful to give us the opportunity to rise above even the shortcomings we may have had in life. So if you're here this morning and you've been touched by this message, I'm going to ask you to stand. We're going to have a song of invitation.